It's no secret that making a great video game is incredibly difficult, requiring the collaboration of hundreds, sometimes even thousands of artists in order to make an excellent final product. These 10 video games, all great works in their own right, nevertheless indulge their wild side for one level, chapter, or mission that just felt totally impossibly out of place. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 totally out of place levels in awesome video games. Number 10. The MJ and Miles stealth levels. Spider-Man. Insomniac's Spider-Man is one of the greatest superhero video games of all time, a stunning exercise in wish fulfillment as players were granted the opportunity to sling around a teeming New York to their heart's content. But for some reason, I guess they assumed that being Spider-Man swinging around New York City was just a little too much fun for us, and so we got mandatory stealth missions featuring Mary Jane and Miles Morales. Not a single living soul bought a Spider-Man game to play dull, frustrating stealth missions as these characters, and while the levels were relatively short, ripping away the feature attraction numerous times throughout the game just felt totally unnecessary. They're not even good stealth missions either. The enemy AI is laughably slow, and getting caught infuriatingly triggers an instant checkpoint restart. Any mission which wrestles control away from the titular superhero in their own video game should be 100% optional. Though thankfully it seems that Insomniac did listen to players, as the Miles Morales spin-off featured nothing of the sort. Thank God. Number 9. Car chase shooting sections. Yakuza. The Yakuza franchise is well known for its kooky minigames and ridiculous sub-stories. That said, it's pretty much mostly known for beating the crap out of an endless stream of goons in a variety of ways. But in both Yakuza 0 and Yakuza Kiwami, Sega made the head-scratching decision to include bizarre shooting gallery segments, where protagonist Kiryu is forced to gun down seemingly never-ending enemy motorcades during high-speed car chases. Far from the beat-em-up shenanigans of each game up to this point, these sequences required players to shoot marked enemies within a set time or suffer damage. As a result, players needed to employ a totally different set of skills than anything the game had taught them up until this point. Between the tight time windows on higher difficulties and lack of checkpointing, each level made for a uniquely annoying experience. Thankfully, Sega seems to have heard the feedback loud and clear, as such levels have been totally absent from more recent Yakuza games. Phew. Number 8. Chapter 13 Redemption. Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy is an absolutely seminal JRPG featuring vast worlds and memorable characters, but what it's certainly not ever is a survival horror game. Right? Well, Final Fantasy XV made the bold, highly divisive decision to offer up its own riff on Resident Evil in the game's 13th chapter, Redemption, where protagonist Noctis is stripped of his weapons and powers. For between 2 and 3 hours, players are forced to slog their way through a repetitive, nightmarish industrial labyrinth, leveling up keycards in order to progress while avoiding the creepy as hell stalker-type enemies wandering the halls. With only the Ring of Lucii to help you escape slippery situations, stealth and hiding are mostly necessary, which couldn't be further from what most people play Final Fantasy games for. The fan outcry was loud enough that Square Enix did patch the section and ensure it was mostly trivial, so at least you get through it quickly. Then again, those who weren't so lucky and played it at launch can definitely remember how agonizing it was. Number 7. Floating Islands. Tomb Raider 2. The Tomb Raider franchise has its fair share of out there levels, but even for those standards, Tomb Raider 2's floating islands are completely unhinged. Floating Islands marks a major aesthetic departure from the rest of the game, throwing Lara Croft into a surreal complex containing impractical architecture, flying jade statues, and yes, physics-averse floating islands. At first glance, this feels like a level that was unfinished and somehow made it into the final game. And to make it even weirder, the story never fully explains what it is we're looking at. We see Lara enter a portal to chase down cult leader Marco Bartoli, but beyond that we have no context whatsoever. Is it a parallel dimension or some sort of hallucination? Who knows? What we do know is that it's unlike anything else in the series, but at least it's out of place in an interesting way. Number 6. Fair Play. Mafia. Though Mafia is a game with its fair share of driving, the major selling point was getting to live out your grubbiest fantasies as a gangster rising through the ranks. Shooting a ton of people, basically. And while the game's driving sequences are pretty fun, nobody needed the infamous detour into racing game territory. Mafia's fifth mission, Fair Play, forces players to take part in a fiendishly difficult race, driving a race car that handles with all the grace and delicacy of Milk Float against egregiously rubber-banded AI, no less. Oh, and you need to come first place in order to move past the level. The original 2002 version of the mission was so absurdly difficult that it caused many players to abandon the game outright. And so when the recent Definitive Edition remake was announced, fans were quick to ask whether Fair Play had finally been nerfed. Thankfully it had been, and now the normal difficulty level of the mode is pretty trivial. That said, there's still the option to play the classic mode if for some reason you just like pain. I don't know, you do you. In a game sold on its living, breathing open world and GTA-style gunplay, why would anyone think we wanted to be sequestered to a closed racetrack for a mission that requires, frankly, supernatural reflexes? Number 5. Zen. Half-Life. Half-Life is undeniably one of the most groundbreaking and influential video games of all time, with about 90% of its action unfolding at the sterile Black Mesa research facility. But in one of the game's final chapters, players are transported to the alien dimension known as Zen. Zen is entirely unlike anything else seen in the game up to this point. Its geometry is composed of free-floating platforms, while low gravity allows Gordon to leap large distances. As a result, players are forced to complete some frustratingly fiddly platforming in order to progress onward. While the level is a brief one, it certainly sticks out like a sore thumb compared to the rest of the game, whether you appreciate its differences in aesthetics or not. Number 4. The Yiga Clan Hideout. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is a phenomenal game that largely grants players the freedom to complete quests however they wish. And then there's the damn Yiga Clan Hideout. Though this section of the game can technically be beaten with weaponry by extremely skilled players, for most the combat will be difficult enough to basically make it a forced stealth sequence. Between the inability to save and the aggressiveness of the enemies if you're spotted, they're much tougher than the end-level boss in fact. It's a maddening level and feels counter to the design philosophy of the rest of the game. Given that Breath of the Wild is so intently focused on allowing players to curate their own experience, a narrow, confined, frustrating stealth mission couldn't seem more out of place. Though ultimately only a short portion of the game, it still feels awkwardly implemented. Number 3. The Gummy Ship, Kingdom Hearts. The Kingdom Hearts games may be wonderfully imaginative, visually stunning RPGs, but was there anyone on Earth who really wanted the series to include rail shooter sections? In order to travel between worlds, players must pilot the Gummy Ship, while shooting down any incoming enemies who get in their way. If you're defeated by an opponent, however, you must try again before being granted access to the next world. In a series defined by its epic magical RPG worlds and dizzying combat, these bland shooter sections feel so out of place. Nobody wanted to play these games because they'd get to pilot a spaceship. They wanted to play it to kick ass alongside Goofy and Donald Duck in a host of Disney-themed lands. Though Square Enix did flesh out these Gummy Ship sections in later titles, they still feel tedious and unnecessary, and likely wouldn't be missed by a lot of people if they were cut entirely. Number 2. The Asteroid Shooting Turret Section, Dead Space. The original Dead Space is a masterclass in gut-wrenching suspense, wielding its delicately crafted atmosphere to keep the player always on edge. But for some reason, the developers decided to throw in an obligatory turret section in the game's 4th chapter, Obliteration Imminent. Protagonist Isaac Clarke has to hop onto a turret to shoot a field of incoming asteroids before they destroy the Ishimura's hull. Beyond the fact that it's a jarring shift from the anxiety-inducing survival horror of the game both up to this point and immediately afterwards, it's also agonizingly difficult, even on normal difficulty, representing a patently unfair spike in an otherwise perfectly manageable game. Worst of all, there's just nothing clever or exciting about the set piece. It's a dead ordinary turret sequence that feels like padding in a game that's otherwise so efficient and well thought out. We can only hope that the upcoming remake just does away with this section entirely, or at the very least gives it a welcome nerf. Number 1. House of Wu. True Crime Streets of LA. Cult classic True Crime Streets of LA was one of the better earlier Grand Theft Auto knockoffs, and for the majority of its campaign, it proved to be a fairly grounded action game centered around Los Angeles' underworld of organized crime. But the latter game chapter, House of Wu, turns the entire thing on its head by randomly introducing zombies. out of nowhere. That's before a boss fight against Ancient Wu, which sees you fending off skull-faced demons, ghostly concubines, and a goddamn dragon. Because why not? Not a single scrap of dialogue up to this point suggested the game was ever gonna go full out supernatural, and especially for those who bought the game due to its apparent similarities to the GTA series, it marked a completely ridiculous tonal departure. This is perhaps the quintessential, well that escalated quickly video game moment. And that's our list. Do let me know down in that comment section if you can think of any other video game levels that seem totally out of place in their games, for better or worse. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm at Jess McDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great content.